All right, welcome back. So we'll begin our voyage into Planescape fiction with two short but rich stories, I would say, by David Zeb Cook. I'll talk about them in separate videos just to keep things a little bit more manageable. But Zeb Cook, was the main designer behind Planescape, and the influences on him at the time are going to be relevant here. So let me mention those. So Cook has been quoted as saying, quote, "By the time I started on Planescape, I had pretty much given up on reading fantasy. Too many years spent working on it. For a long time, I had been reading obscure history, but right around that time, I picked up a batch of experimental fiction. Books like Invisible Cities, Einstein's Dreams, Dream Tigers, and Dictionary of the Khazars had an effect." So that's a quote from David Zeb Cook, referring to Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities, Alan Lightman's Einstein's Dreams, Jorge Luis Borges's Dream Tigers, and Milorad Pavic's Dictionary of the Khazars, books which I'll refer to from time to time when talking about Planescape, and which were influences on how Cook conceived of the world of Planescape. Besides these texts, he's also mentioned various musical works and movies. He's also mentioned the 17th century Japanese writer Matsuo Basho's The Narrow Road to the Deep North, among other things. So some influences to keep in mind, which I'll bring up now and again. Most of the literary influences mentioned by Cook, but especially Dictionary of the Khazars, are reflected in the short piece I'm going to talk about first, The Plain Truth. This story was published in 3 parts in Dragon Magazine in 1994. The 3 parts were subtitled Codifying Sigil, which I'll talk about first, of course. Codifying Sigil, which you see on the screen there. A Journey to the Outlands was the second part, and the third part is called The Transformation. The Plain Truth, of course, Plane, plays on the phrase the plain truth, Plain. And perhaps Cook is signaling that we're going to be introduced to some facts about the planes. And the story is actually a pretty good introduction to Planescape. Cook does give us some basic information about the planes, how the planes work, but more importantly, it introduces the tone and the style of Planescape. And there's an air of mystery and dreaminess and vague dread in this story. And there are some metafictional techniques that you see in various Planescape writings, and there's a kind of Mobius strip-like looping of reality, which is also kind of typical in Planescape stuff. The basic story is about a book called The Codex of Infinite Planes, which takes control of people through their dreams in order to gain a foothold in reality. So I'll look at each of the parts of this story. The first part of the story is subtitled Codifying Sigil, as I already said. Codifying Sigil is framed as a found document. What I mean is that the text is a document that's supposed to exist within the world of the story, within the Planescape universe or multiverse. Specifically, this document is some pages from a notebook of Falindor the Mage, and is presented to us by someone named Magistrate Lachverger or something. It's kind of a vaguely German-looking name. I don't know how you would want to say it, but Lach-Verger. I don't know. The notebook entry that constitutes this part of the story describes Falindor the Mage's dreams of a book called The Codex of Infinite Planes, as I already mentioned. The Codex, Falindor thinks that the Codex exists only in dreams and reveals itself a page at a time to dreamers. Each morning, Falindor writes down a dream page, and he believes that when all the transcriptions of the pages of the dream book are collected, then the book will exist in the real world, will move from dream to reality. The Codex of Infinite Planes also appears to function as a portal. Falandor says, as the dreamer reads the entries in the book, he creates the destination where the Codex will send him. When the image is complete, the traveler arrives. So it can transport you from between places. And I should mention here that the Codex of the Infinite Planes is a long-running artifact in Dungeons & Dragons. Before this, it often has the Codex of the Infinite Planes. In these stories, it will appear as Codex of Infinite Planes. Anyway, it was perhaps first described in print by Gary Gygax, one of the originators of Dungeons & Dragons, along with Brian Bloom, in the D&D supplement Eldritch Wizardry from 1976. Zeb Cook himself included a description of the Codex in his second AD&D supplement, Book of Artifacts. That was from 1993. I think it was first described as being a portal, as having portal-like qualities or mechanics in Gygax's Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide of 1979. And there, Gygax wrote, I'm going to quote a little bit from that Dungeon Master's Guide from 1979. He wrote, any person reading its 99 damned pages is 99% certain to meet a terrible fate. The Codex's other pages have the keys to instant physical transference to any one of the other planes and alternates of any world or universe. So the book had 99 damned pages and then some other pages that would instantly transfer you to somewhere else. Cook gives a similar description in the 1993 Book of Artifacts. He wrote, the Codex, I should say, can open a portal to any plane, demiplane, or prime material world at any location. The Codex would reappear in materials for subsequent D&D editions and also in the Pathfinder role-playing game under various descriptions. But yeah, it's continued to be a thing in the gaming world. Up to 1994, the Codex of the Infinite Planes was portrayed as a very large and very powerful, but also very dangerous artifact that could only be used by a high-level character. Zeb Cook's The Plain Truth and his story, The Analects of Sigil, which I'll discuss later, are the only overt references to the artifact in fiction, as far as I know, in novels or short stories. As we'll see later, however, in a later video, J. Robert King's Blood Wars trilogy makes use of a kind of similar artifact. Also, as far as I know, The Plain Truth is the only text in which the Codex exists or is believed to exist only in dream. And that's an interesting kind of Planescapian twist here, or this dream. We'll see this theme of dreams again and again. There's a bit of influence there from the novels I mentioned earlier, or maybe I don't know if novel is the right word, but things like Dictionary of the Khazars, Invisible Cities. I'll get back to that point later on. But now let's get back to the story, what this story is about. So Falandor the Mage, remember, where there's pages from the Journal of Falandor the Mage. So he hopes to dream of Sigil, this central city in Planescape, the hub. And so he reviews the entries from the Codex relating to Sigil. And the rest of this first part of the story about codifying Sigil is an alphabetized list of entries on Sigil. And these entries include the Aliax of Sigil, which is a mysterious formless creature that takes on properties of from the city around it before driving itself into oblivion at the end of the day. It's another kind of old idea in D&D, the Aliax or Aliax, I'm not sure how to say that, but there's a kind of a Planescape version of that creature. There's an entry for the Dictionaries of Pain, which are pretty much what they sound like. I'll refer to this again later on. There's an entry for the Doom Guard, which is one of the factions within Sigil. Remember, Sigil contains various factions which all believe different things. Some of the factions are kind of aligned with each other, some are opposed to each other. But the Doomguard is the faction within Sigil that seeks the end of all things, that kind of maintains and protects the entropy of the multiverse. There's an entry for factions itself, and this discusses the various groups within Sigil, these groups that are defined by what they believe. Let's see, there's the geography of Sigil, which gives the basics of how Planescape's geography work. There's an entry for the Planescape campaign setting, which talks about Sigil's existence in another reality, which is to say human, kind of our normal mundane reality. There's an entry for portals, which describes interplanar travel. And an entry for the Lady of Pain, about the mysterious guardian of Sigil, about which I'll have a lot more to say in a later video. And these entries are basically variations on descriptions that Cook gives in the various, the three Planescape campaign setting books that were published also in 1994. So a few things to note so far. This first part of the story is very much in the spirit of things like Invisible Cities and Dictionary of the Khazars. And in both of those novels, it's a little odd to talk about them as novels, they're very different than kind of how we normally think of novels. But anyway, those kind of fictional works, Invisible Cities and Dictionary of the Khazars, in both of those, dreams play a major role in constituting reality, somewhat also in Borges's Dream Tigers. Dictionary of the Khazars, as the title suggests, is also an alphabetical set of entries that gradually reveals a fictional history of the Khazars. And the idea of a book that transports you to different places. I mentioned this will also reappear in later Planescape books in J. Robert King's Blood Wars trilogy. I'll also note here the possible significance of the entry on the Dictionaries of Pain. It's interesting that he singles out pain to have a set of dictionaries about it. The Dictionaries of Pain classify all the shadings of anguish, he says. And later on, in another video, we'll talk about Troy Denning's novel Pages of Pain, which is organized around 4 types of pain. So there's a little bit of foreshadowing there as well. And also note the postmodernist metafictional element. So Falandor recognizes that his reality is a fiction in another universe. He writes, there's a quotation from Falandor in the story, or a quotation from Falandor's notebook. It says, "The easy question would be, of course, who dreams who? Is this world the creation of those who imagine it in play? Or are they mere fictions of this realm? But the hard question is this: of the two worlds, one is truthful while the other one lies. So who created the honest world?" So it's that old question of what is reality, and what is the reality of fiction? What is the reality of dream? Which reality is more real? So these are the kinds of questions that Planescape lets us play with in a literary and in a game kind of way. So the first part ends, and this first part of the story ends with another entanglement of dreaming and non-dreaming realities. So at the end of the story, it's written, "At last he, Falandor, dreams the magistrate standing in an empty house, reading the papers Falandor has left behind." So the magistrate, in other words, who is presenting this document to us, is presenting a document which presents the magistrate's own finding of the document. So you get this looping around, entangling, unfolding of the story on itself, where it foretells its own telling, in a matter of speaking, if that makes any sense. Well, let's move on to the second part of the story. The second part of the Plain Truth, as you can see, is called A Journey to the Outlands. And this shifts to the writings of a different character, known as Ambrin the Seeker, half-elven paladin of Ogma's temple at the court of Azun IV, King of Cormyr. How's that for a title? For a person. And Ambran's narrative, it's Ambran, not really sure how to pronounce many of these names, but Ambran, I don't know. Ambran's narrative is eventually going to intersect with Falandor's. So these are not unrelated characters, unrelated stories. They're going to intersect at some point. Ogma, so he's a half-elven paladin. Paladin is one of the classes within Dungeons & Dragons, kind of like a knight. So Ogma's temple. Ogma is the god of knowledge in the Forgotten Realms setting at this time. And Cormyr, so they're in, he was a paladin at the court of the King of Cormyr. Cormyr was one of the major countries within this Forgotten Realms setting. So the paladin is all just kind of background lore, which it can be interesting if you're into this stuff, but not its color for our purposes. So the paladin Ambran has apparently been asked to explore the realms beyond the barriers of Toril. Toril being the planet on which Cormyr exists, basically a fantasy version of Earth. Ambran's journals record his visit to Sigil and his journey into the outlying regions. So it's a little bit of a travelogue kind of a thing. After some time in Sigil, Ambran hires a Bariaur, which is a goat centaur kind of a creature. He hires a Bariaur named Glyn to guide him in the Outlands. The Outlands are the lands around Sigil that lead to all the various planes of existence. There's these gate towns and stuff that lead into planes with their own special qualities and characteristics. And whereas the first part of the story owed much to, I think, Dictionary of the Khazars, the second part seems to borrow more from imaginative travelogues, like perhaps Matsuo Basho's The Narrow Road to the Deep North, perhaps Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities, maybe Alan Lightman's Einstein's Dreams, which are describing different locations. I think those books influenced kind of the descriptive style and maybe the constitution of particular areas within Planescape. But this second part of the story gives you a quick survey of a few outland regions and gate towns. So we are introduced to Ribcage, the gate town to Beator. Try to remember if I'm saying that right. I think it's Beator, which is kind of the Planescape or D&D version of Hell at the time. We see the Vale of the Spine, a mountain range around Ribcage, and Automata, the gate town to Mechanus, which I'll have reason to talk about in the future as well. Just other planes within Planescape. And there's references here to a couple of ideas important to the Planescape setting. So there's references to the Blood War, which is an eternal war between demons and devils, Tanari and Beatezu, within Planescape, or within D&D terminology of the time. They were trying to avoid offending kind of the religious by talking about demons and devils, so they renamed them anyway. We also get references to the Modron Procession, which is a periodic march of mechanical beings called Modrons along the Great Road, which connects the gate towns of the Outlands, at least as an idea it connects the various gate towns in the Outlands, and the Modrons are these mechanical robot kinds of things, and they periodically march along this great road for mysterious reasons. And the second part of the story ends with a brief conversation between Ambran and a member of the entropy-loving Doomguard who has come to watch the Modron March. The Doomguard, remember, are one of the factions of Sigil, one of the groups whose members are united by common beliefs. We get some insight here in this conversation. We get some insight into Doomguard philosophy, which is about protecting the decay of the universe, or maybe better to say the multiverse. It's notable that this Doomguard warrior is from one of the Doomguard citadels of the Inner Planes. This anticipates Cook's other Planescape story, The Analects of Sigil, which I'll talk about in the next video. And then the third part of the story is subtitled The Transformation, so the third part of the Plain Truth. This begins in Chronepsis's mausoleum. Chronepsis is the dragon god of fate, death, and judgment, apparently, whose realm is somewhere underneath the Outlands. So we're still exploring the Outlands, but now we're underground. Ambren spends some time here. After he emerges from this mausoleum, he finds he's lost track of the days. So previously he had been numbering the days as he explored the Outlands, how many days outside of Sigil and so on. And at this point, he's lost track of time completely. Ambren and his Bardi Hour guide Glyn, they continue wandering the Outlands. They pass over Ilsensine's underground realm, the Caverns of Thought. Ilsensine, some more lore here, Ilsensine is the lord of the Illithids, also called Mind Flayers. Creatures that are able to manipulate, kind of telepathically manipulate the minds of others. And at this point, Glyn begins to ask Ambren about his dreams. And in fact, presently, Ambren begins to sense the occurrence within himself of thoughts that are not his own. He begins to have dreams which become stronger and more insistent, he says. His dreams, actually, in fact, we find out, are the dreams of Falandor the Mage, whom we met in part 1 of the story. Falandor feels that he's become the slave of the Codex of Infinite Planes. And while Ambren sleeps, Falandor, through his dreams, tattoos words from the Codex of Infinite Planes on Ambren's body. And in this way, Falandor hopes to release himself from the grip of the Codex. So as Falandor transcribes the Codex onto Ambren, Ambren feels himself becoming less himself and more of someone else. So there's this weird transformation process taking place, hence the term "the transformation" as the subtitle of this part of the story. So Ambren continues on, finally in Bedlam, which is gate town to Pandemonium, the plane of madness. Ambren finds someone who can explain what's happening to him. So he's talking to this fiend leader that he meets, and the fiend leader tells him, to exist and to grow, the book becomes the dreams of a prime. A prime is someone from the prime material plane, basically a kind of human type world. So the book becomes the dreams of a prime. The slave writes what he dreams and goes where the pages take him until eventually the slave is a useless husk. When he finally writes his own page in the dead book, the book waits for another and continues its pages. So the book kind of like takes over a mortal creature who writes down pages from the book and goes where the book takes him until he's basically used up in the process, and then the book goes on to another hapless mortal creature. But sometimes the fiend goes on to tell us, I think it's the fiend or, we find out anyway that sometimes the slave of the book realizes he can escape his burden by sending his dreams to another. And that's what's going on here. So Ambren's passage over the Illithid Lord's realm seems to have enabled some entry into Ambren's mind that Falandor is inserting into, getting into, sending his dreams into. So Ambren is drawn inexorably into Pandemonium. He's kind of lost control of himself by now. Gets drawn in through the gate into Pandemonium. And the story ends with Ambren switching places with Falandor in a cave in Pandemonium. He comes into this cave, and he and Ambren Falandor and Ambren seem to switch places, where Falandor's spirit or soul enters into Ambren's body. And it seems that Ambren's soul is trapped in Falandor's body. So Falandor then is able to leave Pandemonium in Ambren's body, yet he still finds himself enslaved by words. Let me read another passage from the story. So it's written, I thought I was free of the codex, but even now I realize this too was a lie. I no longer see it in my dreams, but its words still bind me. These notes, for one. I cannot resist the urge to write my experiences, even though I always burn them later. My passions are printed on this face. These hands describe the childhood of another body. All the things that Falandor was are written for everyone to see. His hopes and his final treachery. People see this tattooed face and shun me. Words still enslave me. That's the end of the passage. Yeah, so very evocative, a lot to think about there in terms of language and identity. The influence of books like Dream Tigers, Borges's Dream Tigers, Calvino's Invisible Cities, Pavich's Dictionary of the Khazars, seems to weigh heavily on this final part of the story. All of these works, I would say, are pervaded with slippages of identity, slipping and sliding identities, ambiguous identities, and of dreams and poetry and reality all kind of slipping and sliding into each other and folding into each other. Consider, for example, Borges's brief story in Dream Tigers, Borges and I, in which a gap opens up between the private and public Borges, with the private Borges ceding more and more of himself to the public Borges the writer. And the good parts of Borges the writer belong to the Spanish language or to tradition. So you get this weird transformation happening where the private Borges is devoured by the public Borges and the public Borges is devoured by the language. Right? Words still enslave me. Or consider Borges's Parable of the Palace, another story in Dream Tigers. Here, the a poet's poem verbally captures and then, in so doing, dissolves a palace. It so well captures this palace that it causes the palace to cease to exist itself, because you can't have two things that are the same that exist. Or consider Invisible Cities, in which reality is in many times remade to correspond to a dream, or in which dreams correspond to realities that one has in fact never seen. But perhaps more than anywhere else, the reality of dreaming pervades Dictionary of the Khazars, which is in part a dictionary of dream hunting. This is a concept that goes throughout Dictionary of the Khazars. And this dictionary includes such phenomena as people who live only in dreams, moving from dreamer to dreamer, who are tracked by dream hunters. One of the entries in Dictionary of the Khazars describes the ultimate dream figure called Adam Rouhani. So I'll read a little bit of a quotation here from Dictionary of the Khazars, which I think is relevant. So in that book, it is written that if all human dreams could be assembled together, they would form a huge man, a human being, the size of a continent. This would not just be any man, it would be Adam Rouhani, the heavenly Adam, man's angel ancestor, of whom the Imams speak. Dream hunters plunge into other people's dreams and sleep, and from them extract little pieces of Adam the precursor's being, composing them into a whole, into so-called Khazar dictionaries, with the aim of having all these assembled books incarnate on earth the enormous body of Adam Rouhani. And this is a very similar idea as to what's going on with the Codex in this story. Aside from this, Dictionary of the Khazars also describes a Khazar envoy who has the history and topography of the Khazars tattooed on his body. The Plain Truth makes use of this idea of tattooed topography. So recall that Falandor is tattooing Ambrin's body with this information, with these passages from the Codex of Infinite Planes. And an idea similar to this will also appear in the game Planescape Torment, in which tattoos can provide clues to identity as well as special powers. And tattooing, of course, is also a kind of something that's been played around with in speculative fiction in various ways. And there's a couple things left. So I also want to mention that the idea of dreams, the reality of dreams, and dreaming having its own kind of metaphysical reality, or having a portal, providing a portal into other realities. This is also present in a fair amount of fantasy literature, such as some of the books and stories that influenced earlier Dungeons and Dragons novels and stories by people like H.P. Lovecraft and L. Sprague de Camp explore this aspect of dreaming. And there's also interesting parallels. So you can see these interesting parallels between 20th century speculative fiction, Lovecraft, Sprague de Camp, and many others who I have mentioned some of them before. But between these speculative fiction writers and the more kind of magical, realist, avant-garde, postmodern writers like Borges and Pavich, there's interesting parallels there, though it doesn't seem like there was much actual influence, but kind of separately they were exploring very, very similar ideas, and you get something like a convergence of those influences of kind of early speculative fiction, early 20th century speculative fiction, and then somewhat later avant-garde, postmodern fiction. You get those kind of coming together in Planescape through Zeb Cook, who was interested in both. So Zeb Cook would continue exploring these themes in the story The Analects of Sigil, and we're going to look at that next time.